Franklin Delano Roosevelt never crowned himself emperor. He never marched armies across continents to plant flags in foreign soil. He spoke the language of democracy, cooperation, and peace. Yet by the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the world was operating inside a system. He had helped design a system in which American power was central, structural, and enduring. Roosevelt's historical role cannot be reduced to a single achievement. He did not merely rescue the United States from economic collapse, nor did he simply guide it through a global war. His true legacy lies in transformation. He reshaped how power functioned in the modern world. Before FDR, empires ruled through territory. After FDR, dominance flowed through institutions, finance, alliances, and rules. He understood that lasting power does not rely on constant coercion. It relies on dependence, legitimacy, and habit. Through the New Deal, he taught Americans to accept a strong state. Through World War II, he positioned the United States as the indispensable force of victory. Through Lend-Lease and Bretton Woods, he anchored the global economy to American production and currency. Through the United Nations, he wrapped leadership in the language of morality and peace. Roosevelt did not build an empire that needed to announce itself. He built one that worked quietly, efficiently, and persistently, an empire without colonies, without viceroys, and without formal declarations. Its borders were invisible, but its influence was everywhere. This is what makes his legacy so difficult to judge. Was Roosevelt a defender of freedom, or an architect of dominance? Did he save the world from chaos, or simply replace old empires with a new kind of control? Perhaps the most honest answer is that he did both. History rarely offers clean moral victories. Roosevelt made choices under extreme pressure, trading ideals for stability, compromise for structure. Millions benefited from the order that followed. Millions also lived under systems they never chose. The empire he created did not depend on his intentions, it depended on its effectiveness. And that raises the most important question of all. If a democratic leader can build an empire without ever claiming one, if power can hide behind institutions, currencies, and ideals, then where does responsibility truly lie, with the system, or with those who accept it? This story is not only about the past. The world we live in today, its financial rules, its alliances, its conflicts, still bears the imprint of Roosevelt's decisions. Understanding his legacy is not about condemning or celebrating him. It is about recognizing how power really works. So now, the question passes to you. Do you believe Franklin D. Roosevelt saved the world or reshaped it in America's image? Is a hidden empire more dangerous than an open one? And can any global order exist without someone, somewhere, holding the ultimate advantage? If this story made you think, question, or see history differently, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to support deeper, darker, and more honest historical storytelling. Leave a comment and share your perspective, because history is not finished being debated. The empire may be invisible, but the conversation about it should never be silent. When Franklin D. Roosevelt died, the question was not whether the United States would continue to lead the world, but how. The structures were in place, the habits formed, the expectations set. What followed was not a debate about power, but an adjustment to it. Under Harry Truman, American hegemony ceased to be an experiment and became instinct. Truman was not Roosevelt. He lacked the grand vision, the strategic patience, and the instinctive feel for global balance. Yet paradoxically, this made the transition easier. The era of architecture was over. The era of operation had begun. Truman did not need to invent dominance, he inherited it, and the pressures of history ensured he would use it. The post-war world quickly revealed its fractures. Europe lay devastated, economically fragile, and politically volatile. The Soviet Union, victorious yet wounded, moved swiftly to consolidate control over Eastern Europe. What Roosevelt had hoped to manage through cooperation hardened into confrontation. Suspicion replaced alliance. Ideology replaced pragmatism. In this climate, American leadership shifted from subtle design to explicit containment. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or external pressures. It was framed as defense, but its implications were global. For the first time, America committed itself openly to shaping political outcomes far beyond its borders. This was a decisive break from the past. Isolationism was no longer an option. Neutrality was no longer credible. The logic of hegemony demanded permanence. Power, once mobilized, does not easily retreat. The Marshall Plan soon followed an enormous economic intervention to rebuild Western Europe. On the surface, it was humanitarian and stabilizing. Beneath that surface, it was strategic. American aid revived economies, prevented communist influence, and bound Europe tightly to U.S. markets, institutions, and security guarantees. Dependency became partnership, and partnership became alignment. The creation of NATO in 1949 marked another transformation. For the first time in its history, the United States entered a permanent peacetime military alliance. This was unprecedented and irreversible. NATO institutionalized American military leadership in Europe, embedding U.S. forces, command structures, and strategic priorities across the continent. What had once been an emergency wartime presence became a permanent feature of global security. With NATO, hegemony gained muscle. Bretton Woods had structured finance. The United Nations had structured legitimacy. NATO structured force. Together, they formed a comprehensive system, economic, moral, and military, through which American power could operate continuously. The Cold War accelerated this process. Fear replaced exhaustion as the dominant emotion of the age. Nuclear weapons transformed rivalry into existential threat. Every regional conflict became a proxy struggle. In this environment, restraint was interpreted as weakness and dominance as necessity. Crucially, American hegemony no longer required justification in each instance. It was assumed. Interventions, alliances, and economic pressure were explained as maintenance of order rather than expansion of influence. Leadership had become normalized. This normalization marked the point of no return. The United States no longer asked whether it should lead, it asked how best to do so. Presidents changed, parties alternated, but the underlying posture remained. To withdraw would risk chaos. To hesitate would invite rivals. The system rewarded action and punished doubt. This was Roosevelt's deepest legacy. He had transformed power into structure, and structure into habit. Truman merely revealed what had already become unavoidable. The Cold War did not create American hegemony, it locked it in. For the rest of the 20th century, U.S. policy would operate within this inherited framework. From Korea to Vietnam, from Berlin to Cuba, decisions were shaped less by individual ambition than by systemic momentum. The empire no longer required intention. It moved on instinct. And instincts, once formed, are the hardest things to unlearn. By the time the Cold War matured, American dominance was no longer seen as extraordinary, it was seen as the natural order of the world. Allies depended on it. Rivals defined themselves against it. Global stability, for better or worse, revolved around it. This was the irreversible outcome of Roosevelt's era. He did not merely elevate the United States to power. He embedded that power into the behavior of the state itself. After him, hegemony was no longer a choice, it was a condition. The man was gone. The logic remained. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, in the quiet retreat of Warm Springs, Georgia. The news traveled across a world still at war, shocking allies and enemies alike. For many Americans, it felt as if the architect of victory had vanished just before the final act. Yet history would reveal a deeper truth. Roosevelt's greatest creation was not a policy, a speech, or even a war effort. It was a system, and systems do not die when their creators do. By the time Roosevelt's heart stopped, the machinery he had built was already in motion. The war was nearing its end. American industry was unmatched. The dollar stood at the center of global finance. Institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the soon-to-be United Nations were no longer ideas, but realities awaiting full activation. Power had been transferred from personality to structure. Roosevelt's death exposed the difference between leadership and legacy. He had ruled for more than 12 years, longer than any president before or since. His voice had guided the nation through depression and war. But in his final years, his physical strength had waned, even as his geopolitical influence reached its peak. The man who once embodied stability now barely appeared in public, his body failing while his vision solidified. This contrast defined the tragedy of his passing. Roosevelt did not live to see the world he had designed fully emerge. He never witnessed the United Nations convene as a functioning body. He did not watch the Bretton Woods system shape global trade. He did not confront the Cold War that his compromises had helped make inevitable. His absence left unanswered questions: what would he have done differently, and what would he have defended? Harry Truman, his successor, inherited not only the presidency but an empire in formation. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman had not shaped the architecture of global power. Yet he did not need to. The decisions that mattered most had already been made. Alliances, institutions, and economic dependencies now constrained choice. Leadership had become management. This was the defining mark of Roosevelt's achievement. He ensured continuity. Future presidents could alter tactics, but not the framework. The United States would lead through finance, military alliances, and international organizations. It would intervene selectively, justify actions morally, and preserve dominance structurally. Roosevelt had turned power into habit. For the American public, mourning mixed with relief. The war in Europe ended weeks later. Victory in the Pacific followed that summer. Roosevelt's absence allowed his legacy to be associated with triumph rather than the ambiguities of peace. His image froze in history as the leader who guided the nation through its darkest hours. But beyond symbolism lay reality. The system he left behind would shape lives far beyond America's borders. Nations would rebuild according to rules they did not write. Currencies would rise and fall based on decisions made in Washington. Conflicts would be framed through alliances Roosevelt had envisioned. His influence would outlast memory. This endurance invites moral reflection. Roosevelt is often remembered as a champion of democracy and freedom. Yet the empire he helped construct was not neutral. It favored American interests, prioritized stability over justice, and institutionalized inequality between powerful and weak states. His genius lay in making dominance appear inevitable rather than imposed. The biographical tragedy of Franklin D. Roosevelt is that he became indispensable and then irrelevant. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. By embedding power into institutions, he removed the need for his own presence. The empire no longer required its architect. In death, Roosevelt achieved what few leaders ever do: he became replaceable. And in that replaceability lay the ultimate proof of his legacy. Empires built on individuals crumble. Empires built on systems endure. Franklin D. Roosevelt did not live to see the full consequences of his choices. But the world that followed bore his fingerprints everywhere. The man was gone. The order remained. Power is rarely built in moments of moral clarity. More often, it emerges from compromise, calculated, uncomfortable, and irreversible. As World War II neared its end, Franklin D. Roosevelt confronted the harshest truth of global leadership: ideals could not shape the post-war world unless power was first stabilized. To achieve that stability, he was willing to bargain with men he neither trusted nor admired. Chief among them was Joseph Stalin. The alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was never a union of values. It was a marriage of necessity. Nazi Germany posed an existential threat to all three, and defeating it required coordination on an unprecedented scale. Roosevelt understood that without the Red Army, victory in Europe would be delayed, bloodier, and potentially uncertain. Stalin, in turn, knew that Soviet survival depended on Western aid and a second front. Yet as the Axis began to collapse, a new question replaced the old one: what kind of world would follow the war? For Roosevelt, the answer lay in systems: global institutions, economic integration, and American-led stability. For Stalin, it lay in security through control. The Soviet Union had been invaded repeatedly from the West, and Stalin was determined that Eastern Europe would never again serve as a corridor for destruction. Between these visions stood millions of people whose fate would be decided not by elections, but by negotiations. At conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, the outlines of the post-war order were drawn. Publicly, the language was hopeful: self-determination, free elections, collective security. Privately, the realities were far darker. Roosevelt and Churchill knew that the Red Army already occupied much of Eastern Europe. To challenge that presence militarily would mean another war, this time against an ally. and at a cost the world could not bear. Roosevelt made a choice. He prioritized the creation of a global framework, the United Nations, Bretton Woods, a stable balance of power over the immediate political freedom of Eastern Europe. In exchange for Soviet cooperation in the new international order and the war against Japan, Stalin was effectively granted a sphere of influence stretching from Poland to the Balkans. Churchill protested, warning of an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. Roosevelt listened, but remained focused on what he believed was the larger picture. He hoped that institutions, economic engagement, and time would soften Soviet control. He believed Stalin could be managed within a system where American power set the rules. This was not naivete so much as prioritization. Roosevelt understood that moral absolutism could destroy the fragile unity required to prevent another global collapse. He accepted moral loss in one region to secure structural control over the whole. Eastern Europe became the bargaining chip in a much larger game. For the nations caught in between Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, the consequences were devastating. Promises of free elections were broken. Democratic movements were crushed. One authoritarian system replaced another. The language of liberation gave way to decades of repression. This was the human cost of strategic compromise. Roosevelt did not order tanks into Prague or Warsaw, but his decisions made resistance futile. Power, once conceded, is rarely returned voluntarily. Yet from Roosevelt's perspective, the alternative seemed worse. A fractured alliance could have led to prolonged war, economic chaos, or a power vacuum filled by unchecked militarism. By accepting Soviet dominance in the East, he believed he was containing it, limiting its reach, while consolidating American leadership elsewhere. History would judge this bargain harshly, and often rightly. The Cold War that followed revealed the depth of ideological division Roosevelt had hoped to moderate. His belief that cooperation could outlast suspicion proved overly optimistic. But the structure he built endured. This was the final contradiction of Franklin D. Roosevelt's legacy. He spoke of freedom while tolerating oppression. He championed self-determination while negotiating spheres of influence. He believed in moral progress, yet traded it when the architecture of power demanded sacrifice. The pact with Stalin was not a moment of triumph, it was a moment of calculation. It revealed the true cost of empire without colonies, decisions made far from the people they would bind, justified by stability, and paid for in silence. In choosing order over purity, Roosevelt secured American primacy, but at a moral price that history continues to debate. As World War II drew toward its conclusion, Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a familiar problem in a new form. Power alone was no longer enough. The 20th century had revealed what naked domination produced: resentment, resistance, and eventual collapse. If the United States was to lead the post-war world, it could not do so as an empire in name or appearance. It needed legitimacy. The United Nations was designed to provide it. Publicly, the United Nations was framed as humanity's answer to war itself, a forum where nations would resolve disputes through dialogue rather than violence. Its language was deliberately elevated: peace, cooperation, collective security, human rights. After decades of bloodshed and economic ruin, these ideals resonated deeply. Roosevelt understood that moral aspiration was not the opposite of power, but one of its most effective instruments. The idea of a global organization was not new. The League of Nations had attempted something similar after World War I and failed catastrophically. Roosevelt studied that failure carefully. The League lacked enforcement power, and crucially, it lacked American participation. This time, Roosevelt intended to design an institution that the United States would not merely join but lead. The structure of the United Nations reflected this intention. At its core stood the Security Council, where real authority resided. 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, were granted veto power. This arrangement acknowledged a blunt reality: global decisions would be made by the strongest states, not by moral consensus alone. Idealism was preserved in rhetoric, while power was secured in architecture. For the United States, the veto was decisive. It ensured that no action contrary to American interests could pass under the banner of international legitimacy. At the same time, it allowed Washington to frame its own actions as aligned with collective will rather than unilateral ambition. When power moved through institutions, it appeared less like domination and more like responsibility. Roosevelt believed deeply in the usefulness of this duality. He was not naive about human nature or geopolitics. Peace, he understood, was not maintained by goodwill alone, but by structures that reflected actual power relationships. The United Nations reconciled these two truths. It spoke the language of universal ideals, while operating within a hierarchy dominated by great powers, chief among them, the United States. This balance allowed America to lead without openly ruling. Military interventions, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure could be justified as international obligations rather than national choices. Even when consensus was fractured, the presence of the United Nations shaped perception. To act within its framework was to act lawfully, to oppose it was to appear disruptive or irresponsible. Critics quickly recognized the contradiction. How could an organization dedicated to equality among nations grant extraordinary privileges to a few? How could peace be enforced by those with the greatest capacity for violence? These tensions were real and intentional. The United Nations was not designed to eliminate power politics, but to manage them under a moral umbrella. For Roosevelt, this was not hypocrisy but strategy. He believed that ideals without enforcement were meaningless, and enforcement without ideals was unsustainable. The United Nations fused the two. It transformed American leadership into something palatable, even desirable, for a war-weary world. Equally important was symbolism. The headquarters of the United Nations would be located in New York. Diplomats from every nation would travel to the United States to debate the fate of the world. This constant presence reinforced America's centrality, not only economically and militarily, but morally and culturally. Global governance now had an American address. Roosevelt did not live to see the United Nations fully take shape, but its DNA bore his imprint. It was the final pillar of the post-war order he envisioned: financial dominance through Bretton Woods, security dominance through alliances, and moral dominance through institutions. The United Nations did not end war. It did not erase inequality. But it accomplished something equally significant: it normalized American leadership as the default condition of global order. Power, once feared, was now wrapped in the language of peace. This was the essence of modern hegemony. Not conquest, but consent. Not rule by force alone, but rule by ideals that made power appear necessary, inevitable, and even virtuous. By the time World War II was approaching its end, Franklin D. Roosevelt understood a truth that many leaders missed: winning the war was not enough. Whoever designed the peace would control the future. Empires did not survive merely by defeating enemies. They endured by shaping systems. Bretton Woods was the moment when the United States transformed wartime dominance into a permanent global order. In July 1944, while battles still raged across Europe and the Pacific, representatives from 44 nations gathered in the quiet resort town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Officially, the conference aimed to prevent another global economic collapse like the Great Depression. Unofficially, it was something far more ambitious: the construction of a new financial architecture for the entire world, designed, anchored, and controlled by the United States. The setting itself symbolized the shift in power. Previous global financial rules had been written in London or Paris. Now the world came to America. The reason was simple and unavoidable. The United States held the majority of the world's gold reserves. Its industry was intact. Its economy was expanding while others lay in ruins. No nation could afford to ignore American leadership, even if it resented it. At Bretton Woods, the United States proposed a system that appeared cooperative but ensured dominance. Two new institutions would stand at its core: the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. The IMF would stabilize currencies and manage balance of payments crises. The World Bank would finance reconstruction and development. Together, they promised order, growth, and stability. But the true foundation of the system was the US dollar. Under the Bretton Woods framework, global currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold. This arrangement elevated the US currency to a unique status. It became the world's reserve currency. Nations no longer measured value primarily against gold, but against American money. Trade, loans, and reserves increasingly flowed through the dollar, and therefore through the United States. This was power without precedent. By controlling the currency at the center of global exchange, the United States gained influence over inflation, liquidity, and financial stability far beyond its borders. Decisions made by American policymakers could ripple across continents. Monetary policy became geopolitical strategy. Roosevelt and his advisors understood the elegance of this system. Traditional empires required armies, administrators, and constant repression. Bretton Woods required none of these. Countries joined voluntarily, drawn by the promise of stability and access to capital. Once inside, departure became costly. Economic survival became linked to compliance with rules set largely in Washington. The IMF and World Bank reinforced this structure. Financial assistance came with conditions reforms, austerity measures, policy adjustments that shaped domestic choices in borrowing nations. Sovereignty remained intact on paper, but was constrained in practice. Power operated through incentives and penalties rather than occupation. This was the birth of what might be called an invisible empire. There were no colonies, no viceroys, no imperial flags. Instead, there were institutions, voting shares, and reserve currencies. Influence was exercised quietly, continuously, and globally. Critically, Bretton Woods also legitimized American leadership. The system was framed not as domination, but as cooperation. The language was technical, neutral, and humanitarian. Stability replaced conquest as the justification for power. In a world traumatized by war and depression, order was irresistible. Franklin D. Roosevelt did not live to see the full consequences of Bretton Woods, but its logic was unmistakably his. He recognized that the post-war world would not be governed by empires of land, but by empires of rules. Whoever wrote those rules would govern by default. Through Bretton Woods, the United States achieved what previous empires could not: global reach without global rule. The world remained politically fragmented, but economically integrated around an American core. The result was a system so deeply embedded that it outlived its creator and even the conditions of its birth. This was not the end of empire. It was its evolution. An empire without colonies, without proclamations, without visible chains, yet one that quietly shaped the fate of nations through the language of finance, stability, and trust. By the time the guns fell silent, the foundations of a global empire, one without colonies, but rich in control, had already been laid. Empires are often imagined as products of conquest, armies marching, flags raised, territories seized. Franklin D. Roosevelt envisioned something far more subtle and enduring. Instead of ruling through occupation, he chose leverage. Instead of chains, he used credit. During World War II, the United States did not merely fight the war, it financed it. And in doing so, it transformed itself into the world's indispensable banker. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in 1941, was presented to the American public as a generous and pragmatic policy. The United States, Roosevelt argued, would lend weapons, supplies, and resources to nations fighting tyranny, to be returned or compensated after the war. It sounded temporary, transactional, almost charitable, but beneath its language lay a profound shift in global power. Through Lend-Lease, the United States supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other allies with tanks, aircraft, food, oil, and raw materials. The scale was unprecedented. By the war's end, the total value exceeded $50 billion, an astronomical sum for the time. Entire armies marched on American steel. Entire air forces flew on American fuel. Entire populations survived on American grain. This was not merely assistance, it was dependency. As European economies collapsed under the weight of total war, American factories expanded. While London endured bombings and Moscow bled manpower, the U.S. mainland remained intact, humming with production. The imbalance grew larger with every shipment. Roosevelt understood the strategic implications perfectly. A nation that supplies the tools of survival gains influence over those who depend on them. Lend-Lease allowed the United States to shape military priorities, coordinate logistics, and insert itself into the decision-making processes of its allies. Even the Soviet Union, ideologically hostile and fiercely independent, became reliant on American trucks, food, and industrial equipment to sustain its war effort. More importantly, Lend-Lease marked the moment when financial power began to eclipse military power as the primary instrument of dominance. The United States did not need to station troops everywhere. It did not need to administer colonies. It needed only to control the flow of resources, and later, the flow of money. By war's end, the traditional financial centers of the world were ruined. London, once the heart of global finance, was deeply indebted and economically exhausted. Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo lay in ruins. Gold reserves flowed toward American vaults. The dollar, backed by industrial output and untouched infrastructure, emerged as the only credible foundation for reconstruction. Roosevelt anticipated this outcome. Lend-Lease was not designed to be repaid in kind. It was designed to reorder the hierarchy of nations. When the war ended, America would not simply ask for money back, it would demand alignment. Access to U.S. markets, participation in American-led institutions, and acceptance of rules written in Washington became the true price of recovery. This approach redefined what empire meant in the modern age. Control no longer required direct rule. Influence could be exercised through loans, trade agreements, and reconstruction plans. Nations remained formally sovereign, but economically constrained. Their choices narrowed to those compatible with American interests. The genius of this system lay in its invisibility. There were no occupying governors, no imperial proclamations. Instead, there were contracts, currencies, and obligations. Power was embedded in balance sheets rather than battlefields. Resistance became difficult, not because it was forbidden, but because it was financially suicidal. Lend-Lease also reshaped American self-perception. The United States no longer saw itself as a distant observer or reluctant participant in global affairs. It became the central pillar upon which victory and later stability rested. This role conferred not only power, but moral authority. To oppose American leadership increasingly meant risking economic isolation. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt's health began to fail, the transformation was irreversible. The United States had become the lender of last resort, the supplier of survival, the axis around which the wartime world revolved. Guns had won battles, but money had won position. In lending to the world, America did more than finance a war. It secured a future in which influence flowed through dollars rather than divisions, credit rather than conquest. The grip was quiet, but firm, and once closed, it would not easily be loosened. World War II did not arrive suddenly for Franklin D. Roosevelt. Long before American soldiers stormed beaches or bombers crossed oceans, the war had already begun in calculations, compromises, and quiet decisions made behind closed doors. While much of the American public clung to isolation, Roosevelt was preparing the nation for a conflict it did not yet want to fight, but would soon be unable to avoid. Throughout the 1930s, the memory of World War I haunted the United States. Americans viewed foreign wars as traps set by bankers, arms dealers, and old empires. Congress passed neutrality acts to prevent the nation from being dragged into another catastrophe. Opinion polls showed overwhelming resistance to any form of military involvement abroad. To openly call for war would have been political suicide. Roosevelt understood this reality and chose a different path. Rather than confront public opinion directly, he worked around it. His strategy was gradual, indirect, and calculated. He framed each step not as preparation for war, but as a measure for peace, security, or economic recovery. Yet taken together, these steps formed a quiet mobilization unprecedented in American history. Even as he spoke the language of neutrality, Roosevelt expanded military production. Factories were retooled, shipyards revived, and defense contracts quietly distributed. The American economy, still struggling under the Depression, found new momentum through rearmament. War preparation became an economic solution disguised as national insurance. Behind the scenes, Roosevelt saw what many refused to accept: the collapse of the international order was inevitable. Nazi Germany was not simply another European power, it was a revolutionary force intent on reshaping the continent. Japan's expansion across Asia threatened global trade and balance. Britain, isolated and exhausted, stood as the last barrier against total domination by authoritarian empires. Roosevelt's challenge was not whether to act, but how. He could not declare war without provocation, yet he could not allow the world to be reshaped without American influence. His solution was to blur the line between neutrality and involvement. The Lend-Lease program was the most decisive expression of this strategy. By supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies with weapons, food, and fuel, the United States became the logistical backbone of the anti-Axis war effort without officially entering the war itself. Roosevelt famously described it as lending a neighbor a hose to put out a fire. In reality, it was a masterstroke of Power America armed the world while preserving its freedom of action. Through Lend-Lease, Roosevelt achieved multiple objectives at once. He kept Britain alive. He tied Allied survival to American production. He transformed the United States into the arsenal of democracy, a role that elevated it economically, militarily, and morally. Most importantly, he ensured that when the war ended, no major power could ignore American interests or American debts. At the same time, Roosevelt engaged in a dangerous game of provocation and restraint. U.S. naval patrols escorted Allied ships across the Atlantic. American destroyers clashed indirectly with German submarines. In the Pacific, economic sanctions tightened around Japan, cutting off oil and resources critical to its expansion. Each move increased pressure, narrowing the space for neutrality. Roosevelt understood that history often requires an event to unlock public consent. He did not seek war recklessly, but neither did he fear it. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the nation's resistance collapsed overnight. The war Roosevelt had prepared for, but could not openly declare, was now unavoidable and politically unanimous. Once the United States entered the conflict, the transformation was immediate. The industrial capacity Roosevelt had quietly built exploded into full mobilization. American factories outproduced entire continents. Military power expanded at a scale no empire in history had achieved in such a short time. The state Roosevelt had strengthened through the New Deal now revealed its true potential. World War II became the golden moment of American power. While Europe and Asia burned, the U.S. mainland remained untouched. Rivals exhausted themselves. Allies grew dependent. By the time victory approached, it was clear that the war was not merely destroying old empires, it was selecting a successor. Roosevelt knew this. He was not fighting only to defeat enemies, but to shape what came after them. The war provided legitimacy, urgency, and leverage. Under its cover, the United States moved from reluctant participant to central architect of the future world. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. It was something more durable. War gave Roosevelt the opportunity to convert preparation into dominance, production into influence, and sacrifice into authority. The New Deal was not a single policy, nor a finished blueprint. It was an experiment bold, improvised, and unprecedented through which Franklin D. Roosevelt tested how far the power of the American state could be stretched in the name of survival. Before global dominance could ever be imagined, Roosevelt first had to answer a more immediate question: could the United States accept a strong central government without tearing itself apart? In the early days of his presidency, Roosevelt moved with speed that shocked Washington. The traditional rhythm of legislation, slow, cautious, restrained, was replaced by urgency. During the first 100 days, Congress passed sweeping laws at a pace unseen in American history. Banks were closed, inspected, and reopened under federal authority. The dollar was taken off the gold standard. New agencies emerged almost overnight, their acronyms AAA, CCC, WPA, TVA becoming symbols of a new relationship between citizens and the state. This was a radical departure from the American past. For generations, the federal government had been expected to do little and interfere less. Economic life was largely left to private actors, and hardship was considered a personal burden rather than a collective responsibility. The New Deal overturned this logic. It asserted that mass unemployment, poverty, and financial collapse were not moral failures, but systemic ones, and that only the state had the scale to respond. Roosevelt did not merely expand government, he normalized its presence in everyday life. Millions of Americans received their first paychecks directly from federal programs. Farmers adjusted production according to government planning. Workers gained protections, unions gained legitimacy, and corporations learned that Washington was no longer a distant observer, but a permanent force. Authority, once fragmented, was increasingly centralized. Critics accused Roosevelt of authoritarianism. Some warned that the New Deal was a step toward socialism, even dictatorship. Yet Roosevelt understood something crucial: power is more easily accepted when it delivers relief. As long as people felt protected, employed, insured, stabilized, they were willing to tolerate a stronger state. Consent was not coerced, it was earned through visible action. This period revealed Roosevelt's deeper strategic instinct. The New Deal was not only about recovery, it was about capacity. Through it, the federal government learned how to mobilize labor, direct capital, manage infrastructure, and coordinate vast systems across the nation. These were not just economic tools, they were instruments of power. What was being built was a domestic command structure, capable of acting quickly and decisively in moments of crisis. In this sense, the New Deal functioned as a rehearsal. Long before wartime mobilization, the United States practiced large-scale coordination under civilian leadership. Bureaucracies expanded, data was collected, planning became normal. The state learned how to see the nation as a whole, rather than as a collection of isolated markets and local authorities. This shift would prove decisive when the world moved toward war. Equally important was the psychological transformation. Americans began to see the federal government as a guarantor of stability. Trust, once placed almost exclusively in private enterprise or local institutions, was redirected upward. The presidency itself became the focal point of national hope and anxiety. Roosevelt's fireside chats reinforced this connection, turning governance into a personal dialogue between leader and population. By the late 1930s, the United States was still struggling economically, but something fundamental had changed. The country was no longer allergic to centralized power. It had learned that authority could be protective rather than oppressive. The idea of a strong state, once feared, had been domesticated. This was domestic hegemony, the establishment of unquestioned leadership within national borders. Roosevelt did not rule by decree, but he reshaped expectations. He proved that the American system could bend without breaking, that democratic institutions could coexist with expansive executive power under the right conditions. Only after this transformation could global ambition become possible. A nation that rejects authority cannot project it abroad. The New Deal forged the internal architecture of power that would later be extended outward through finance, military organization, and international institutions. Before the United States became a global hegemon, it became something equally important: a country comfortable with power. And at the center of that transformation stood Franklin D. Roosevelt, using crisis not merely to govern, but to redefine what governance itself could be. The Great Depression was not merely an economic disaster, it was a psychological rupture. It shattered faith in markets, in institutions, and in the very idea that progress was inevitable. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared to take the oath of office in March 1933, the American people were not simply poor, they were afraid. And fear, more than ideology or ambition, creates the conditions in which power can expand. Banks collapsed in waves, taking life savings with them. 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed. Farmers watched crops rot while families starved. Cities filled with shantytowns mockingly named Hoovervilles, symbols of a government perceived as absent and indifferent. The rules that had once governed American capitalism, limited government, balanced budgets, faith in self-correction, now appeared not only outdated, but dangerous. In moments like this, societies begin to change what they are willing to accept. Before the Depression, a strong federal government was often viewed with suspicion, even hostility. Centralized power was associated with monarchy, tyranny, or European decay. But as the crisis deepened, those fears were gradually replaced by a more urgent one: collapse. When survival is at stake, restraint becomes a luxury. The Depression created a vacuum, a space where old ideas failed and new ones were desperately needed. Into that vacuum stepped Franklin D. Roosevelt. He did not invent the crisis, but he understood it. More importantly, he understood what fear does to public consent. People who once resisted authority now demanded direction. Citizens who once prized independence now sought protection. The same population that feared government power began asking why the government was not powerful enough. Roosevelt's genius lay not in offering certainty, but in offering motion. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he declared, reframing panic as the enemy rather than policy or ideology. This was not merely rhetoric, it was a transfer of psychological authority. By naming fear and confronting it publicly, he positioned himself as the figure capable of containing it. Under normal circumstances, many of Roosevelt's proposals would have been politically impossible. Massive public spending, federal intervention in banking, government regulation of industry, and direct employment programs all violated long-standing American norms. Yet the Depression rewrote the boundaries of the acceptable. When systems fail completely, people no longer ask whether change is radical, they ask whether it works. Power, in this context, did not arrive through force. It arrived through necessity. Congress ceded authority to the executive branch because speed mattered more than procedure. Courts hesitated because resistance risked appearing indifferent to suffering. The public, exhausted and anxious, granted Roosevelt a level of trust no modern president had ever enjoyed. This moment marked a critical transformation. The American state learned how to act decisively in crisis. The federal government became an active manager of the economy rather than a passive referee. Roosevelt did not seize power in a dramatic coup. He accumulated it through emergency, precedent, and expectation. Each intervention made the next one easier. Each success justified further expansion. Crucially, this lesson would not remain confined to domestic policy. Roosevelt absorbed a deeper insight from the Depression that fear is not only destructive, it is productive. It breaks resistance. It accelerates consent. And when guided carefully, it can be transformed into legitimacy. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, other leaders were drawing similar conclusions, though with darker intentions. Fascist regimes exploited fear to justify repression and conquest. Roosevelt, by contrast, used fear to justify reform and stabilization. Yet the underlying mechanism was the same: crisis reorganizes power. By the mid-1930s, the United States was still not a global leader, but it was becoming something new. It was a nation learning how to mobilize resources, centralize authority, and act at scale under pressure. The Great Depression did not make America strong again overnight, but it taught its leaders how strength could be constructed. This was the quiet prelude to global dominance. Before tanks rolled across Europe and bombs fell over Asia, the United States learned a more subtle lesson at home, that in moments of collective fear, leadership expands, resistance contracts, and history becomes malleable. Franklin D. Roosevelt did not waste that lesson. He would soon apply it to a world descending into far greater chaos. Before Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, the United States was already a giant but a hesitant one. It possessed vast natural resources, an expanding industrial base, and a population larger than most European nations combined. By the end of World War I, America had emerged richer than its allies and less devastated than its enemies. Yet despite this advantage, the nation refused to step fully onto the world stage. It was a power without ambition, a colossus that chose to look inward rather than outward. The trauma of World War I left a deep scar on the American psyche. Over 100,000 American soldiers had died in a war many citizens barely understood. When the fighting ended, the dominant sentiment was not triumph, but disillusionment. Europe, to many Americans, appeared ancient, corrupt, and perpetually violent, a continent determined to destroy itself again and again. The prevailing belief was simple: the old world's problems were not America's responsibility. This mindset shaped U.S. policy throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. America rejected the League of Nations, despite President Woodrow Wilson having conceived it. Congress feared that international commitments would drag the country into foreign wars and erode national sovereignty. Isolationism was not merely a political position, it was a cultural instinct. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were seen as natural shields, wide enough to protect America from global chaos. Economically, the United States appeared strong on the surface, but that strength was brittle. The roaring prosperity of the 1920s was unevenly distributed, fueled by speculation, debt, and fragile financial structures. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the illusion collapsed. Banks failed by the thousands. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared to levels unseen in modern history. Breadlines replaced optimism, and confidence in institutions evaporated. By 1933, the United States was paralyzed not just economically, but psychologically. Americans no longer believed their system was invincible. The federal government seemed weak and reactive, bound by old doctrines that offered no answers to modern catastrophe. Abroad, the country retreated even further, convinced that global entanglements would only worsen domestic suffering. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was not waiting. In Europe, democracy was faltering under the pressure of economic collapse. Fascist regimes rose by promising order, pride, and revival. In Germany, Adolf Hitler transformed humiliation into rage. In Italy, Mussolini preached empire. In Japan, militarism advanced quietly but relentlessly across Asia. The global order established after World War I was cracking, and no single power appeared willing or able to stop it. America watched from a distance, uncertain and divided. It had the resources to influence events, but not the will. It had money, but no coherent strategy. It had strength, but no vision for leadership. The nation was like a storm-resistant ship anchored in a harbor, convinced that staying put was safer than sailing into uncertain seas. This was the America Franklin D. Roosevelt inherited, wealthy yet wounded, powerful yet hesitant, secure yet fearful. A country standing at the edge of a coming storm, unaware that isolation would soon become impossible, and that history was about to force it into a role it had never truly wanted, but would soon redefine entirely. In the spring of the 20th century's darkest decades, the most powerful man on earth could not stand on his own 2 feet. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, ruled from a wheelchair, his legs paralyzed, his body permanently weakened by polio. To the public, this truth was carefully hidden. Photographs were staged, movements controlled, pain concealed behind a confident smile. Yet behind the illusion of strength stood a man whose physical fragility contrasted violently with the scale of the power he would come to wield. This is the central paradox of Franklin D. Roosevelt, a leader, immobilized in body, yet unmatched in his ability to move nations, economies, and the very structure of global power. While he struggled daily with pain and dependency, he commanded the largest industrial machine the world had ever known. While he relied on others to lift him from chair to car, entire continents would soon rely on decisions made from his desk. History often associates power with physical dominance: kings on horseback, generals on battlefields, emperors leading armies. Roosevelt shattered that image. His strength was not visible in muscle or posture, but in patience, calculation, and timing. He understood that the modern world was no longer conquered solely by armies, but by systems, financial systems, political institutions, and rules written during moments of global collapse. As the world slid toward chaos, economic depression, fascism, and total war, Roosevelt did not rush forward like a conqueror. He waited. He listened. He allowed crises to ripen. And when the moment came, he positioned the United States not merely as a victor, but as the architect of what would follow. This story does not begin with bombs or battles. It begins with silence, restraint, and a man seated in a wheelchair, quietly preparing to reshape the balance of power for generations to come.